This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. This week on the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, I want to go back to a topic that I've been going on about from the very beginning, which is what to make of the situation in China. And I think that over the last 6 months in particular, maybe a bit longer, there seems to be a fundamental reset going on in China, a fundamental transformation. And it's very difficult to figure out exactly what this might mean. Now, I'm not a China scholar. I don't speak the language. I'm not immersed in Chinese history. And I really know a few people in China, but not that many. And I've been there 3 times. And one of the jokes we make as geographers is if you go to a place 3 times, you're in a situation to write a book about the place. So this is the situation. But what I do is I try to keep up in the press, particularly the Financial Times and Financial Press and the like, in terms of what's going on. But I also have a long history of trying to figure out how to situate China in relationship to the situation of contemporary capital accumulation and geopolitics and all the rest of it. And in doing this, I want to go back a little bit to a colleague of mine who I worked with in the 1990s a lot when I was at Johns Hopkins. That's Giovanni Arrighi. Now, Giovanni had been in China during the Cultural Revolution, had visited many, many times. He's read a great deal of history, knows a lot of the people working on that history. So he has a view on China which I really do respect. He wrote a book which came out in 2009, 2010 called Adam Smith in Beijing. And at that time, I had also written a book on a brief history of neoliberalism. And in that book, I'd felt obliged to try to say something about, well, what to make of what was going on in China. And I read all the press. I did what I could to find out about it all. And I wrote a rather long chapter. And the title of the chapter was Neoliberalism with Chinese Characteristics. Now, Giovanni didn't particularly like the term neoliberalism. He would use it on occasion. But he certainly didn't like the idea that China was neoliberal with Chinese characteristics. And in his book, which came out in 2009, he called Adam Smith in Beijing. He tried to situate China against the background of its long history. And that was Giovanni's forte, was to look at things in terms of what we call the longue durée, the last 500 years of Chinese history. And he was deeply immersed in that history and I think understood China far more than I did. But one of the things that came up, we had a sort of a debate. And if you want to go see it, you can get it on YouTube. It's Giovanni at Red Emma's in Baltimore. And it's a debate between Giovanni, myself, and others about how to interpret what he was doing in this book on Adam Smith in Beijing. And in the course of that debate, I was kind of basically saying to Giovanni, look, China has gone capitalist. There's no way of avoiding that. Everything is done in the 1990s. It's joined the WTO. It's repressing labor, and there were big strikes going on in China at that time, although we had very great difficulty in finding any information about it. So I was kind of saying, look, it's a done deal. It's gone capitalist, and that's that. It's a state capitalist configuration. And Giovanni's response to that was to say, well, maybe you're right. And then he quoted the famous statement by Chu Enlai when he was asked about what the significance, to assess the significance of the French Revolution for Chinese history. And his answer was, it's too early to tell. And Giovanni said, look, it's too early to tell. What is happening in China is not a done deal. It is possible. It could shift this way. It could be shifting that way. It's possible that it's going the way that you think it's going, but it's also possible it's going another way. And since then, I think I've recognized the wisdom of Giovanni's words and started to think, well, okay, whatever happens at a particular historical point, you can't extrapolate from that and say that's where China is going to be in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, or that is the direction it's taking. But we are faced with this dilemma that there are rapid changes occurring in China right now. We have to come to terms with what they're about, and we have to start to think about, well, will China take a different path? And if it does, what is the significance of that path in relationship to the rest of the world economy? Just to give you a simple example, China is one of the biggest producers of steel, huge amounts of steel. The steel industry has been expanding like crazy over the last 30 or 40 years in China. And of course, that puts big demand on iron ore and all the rest of it. Now, steel is connected with an economy which is very much connected to greenhouse gas emissions, both in the production of steel, but also in the kinds of things you're going to build with steel, right? Particularly highways and the like. So the steel industry has been expanding, but just recently, China has suddenly cut back on steel production, cut back fast, and that. Now, some people will say this is an opportunistic move by the Chinese, and it may well be an opportunistic move so that it can go to the Glasgow conference on climate change, and it will be in a position of saying, well, we're cutting back on steel, we're really serious about greenhouse gas emissions, and we're doing so. So it could be just that. But the fact that it's cut back on steel has had huge immediate economic impact on all those countries producing iron ore. So that Brazil has taken a hit. South Africa has taken a hit. So my point here is that a simple decision by China, which is guided perhaps by this climate problem, that simple decision has global ramifications, and global ramifications that have to be looked at because they will have further ramifications in terms of well-being in not only in Brazil and South Africa, but also the balance of payments of those countries is going to be in difficulty. And, the knock-on effects of this decision by the Chinese is huge. Now, if that is the case just simply with steel production, it's certainly going to be the case with many of the other things that are going on. And here too, the question is arising, well, what do all these changes mean? Now, you can add these changes up in a variety of ways. The background, and here I think it's very important to understand this, the background, of course, has been a very rapid growth of an ultra-rich billionaire class in China. Last year alone, 268 new billionaires emerged in China. And that puts China sort of very close to the United States in the number of billionaires that exist. These billionaires have tremendous kind of political or have tremendous economic power. And I think the Communist Party could well look at this and say, yes, they have economic power, and that will mean they will get political power, and therefore to defend the Communist Party, we have to control the billionaires. So one of the things that's happened is that many of the billionaires suddenly find themselves under attack for their immense wealth, and under attack because of the immense concentrations of wealth which are occurring particularly in the high-tech sector. So the signs are that the state in China and the party in China is really putting controls and regulatory structures on the big companies, and is doing so in such a way as to defang them and render them less economically powerful, so that one of the big corporations has been divided into two, and we're likely to see much more of that. And furthermore, when one corporation was looking to raise money on Wall Street, suddenly the Chinese state stepped in and on security grounds nixed them, and they couldn't raise any money on Wall Street. And so the habit of these big corporations in China of raising money offshore externally is being pushed so that they have to do it in Hong Kong or in Shanghai. rather than outside of the country. So here too, it seems the Chinese Communist Party is very nervous about the fact that these big corporations and the bosses of these big corporations have valid interests abroad in the United States, in Canada, and in Europe, and that is being parlayed in many respects, as far as we know, in terms of property ownership of Chinese, wealthy Chinese, of big properties in Vancouver or in Melbourne or in New York or in London and so on. So the Chinese Communist Party is obviously very, very nervous about this incipient class formation, an oligarchy which is emerging in China. The response of the oligarchy has been to sort of try to play nice and say they will do whatever that has to be done. And what do the Chinese want to be done? Here, again, something is very, very, very significant in terms of shifting dialogue within the Chinese economic space. And the dialogue is increasingly focused on inequality. And the inequalities that have risen in China now, China was the most egalitarian country in the world in 1980. About 2 or 3 years ago, it was judged to be one of the most inegalitarian countries in the world because of the tremendous disparities in income and wealth. And that is a situation, again, which it seems the Chinese Communist Party is not very, very happy about. And so there is an attack upon huge concentrations of wealth. And these concentrations of wealth are of two sorts. First, there is a concentration of wealth in terms of certain corporations and the leadership of those corporations. That's one. But the second is the concentrations of wealth in the main metropolitan areas. So that the inequality in China, which is felt, is of two sorts. One is the inequality between the tremendous consumerism and facilities and high educational standards and healthcare standards in places like Beijing and Shanghai, and the far less social provision and social opportunity in the second-tier cities. And when you get down to the third-tier cities, they're pretty much deserts when it comes to social provision. So one of the things that China is very concerned about is to try to spread out the wealth from one part of China to the other, and to make a much more egalitarian structure in which the metropolitan areas are not dominating all else. This issue, by the way, of metropolitan dominance is a global problem. In the United States, if you look at the electoral map of the United States, in territory, it's all Trump territory, and only a small part of the United States territorially is in favor of the Democrats. But that small part is concentrated in something like 15 to 20 major metropolitan areas, and they produce most of the GDP in the United States, and that's where most of the wealth and most of the population is concentrated, leaving a lot of rural areas very badly served in all sorts of ways. Well, China has exactly the same problem, but China is now looking into ways in which it can somehow or other smooth out this uneven geographical development and make the educational possibilities and the healthcare and all that kind of thing much more egalitarian. So we have this situation then of an attack upon the large corporations by the Communist Party. They're being examined very carefully in terms of their structures and their practices. The degree to which they have monopoly power is being questioned, and we're likely to see breakups going. And the way in which the corporations were approached by the Communist Party led to them becoming devalued, so the stock value in Hong Kong and also in New York declined very rapidly as a result of all of this, which leads some people to kind of say, well, this looks like it's Maoism all over again. They're having their own new cultural revolution, and that vision is prompted by the sudden attack upon the glamorous figures in the entertainment industries and films and all the rest of it, and public attacks upon them in terms of their personal values as well as in terms of their wealth and power and all the rest of it. So, and then the Chinese have gone even to the point of saying, "Oh, children are watching far too much video games. So children are going to be banned from watching video games, except they'll maybe have 3 hours a weekend to do it." This is taking things pretty far. So this is almost sounds like a rather rigorous, rigid mantras of the Cultural Revolution. So people are talking about that, and that all of this, of course, is then associated with this idea that China is becoming a much more authoritarian country. Power is centralized, increasingly centralized, the power around Xi Jinping, and therefore we're getting this sort of repeat of the Cultural Revolution. Now, I think that is not what is going on. Xi is very critical of the Cultural Revolution. He realizes the negative sides of it. On the other hand, he is trying to use centralized power to try to reconfigure very much the direction that China will take. And that reconfiguration has everything to do with Xi realizing that there is a need to create a kind of society which deals with the well-being of the population on an egalitarian kind of basis. And he has announced that there are 3 mountains they need to climb. The 3 mountains are education, healthcare, and housing. And his argument here is that the accessibility of healthcare, education, and housing is not egalitarian. A lot of it has been privatized. A lot of wealth is now being stored in the property market sector by the middle classes. And there's a lot of speculation going on values and so on. We know in education that education has been always to some degree privatized in the sense that a certain amount of money had to be put up by parents for their children, but that there's a huge industry has grown up, which is giving tuition, tutorials, if you like, to students to try to educate them to the level where in the competitive exam, which allocates them to the universities, they come out on top. And so there's a huge industry of this. China once fell swoop and basically abolished it and said basically it wasn't going to allow the kind of bought advantage that's occurring in the education. Of course, we see the same thing going on in this country, but nobody's talking about abolishing tuition, kind of special tutorial assistance to students to get them into Harvard and all the rest of it. But in China, getting into one of the elite universities is, of course, a passport to wealth and fame. And the Chinese are very aware of this, and so there's a great deal of competition going on. And the competition takes money, and the monetization of that competition is what the Chinese have been objecting to. So they've wiped that out almost overnight. It was, by the way, a very significant business. A lot of people were employed in it. I don't know how many people. I saw a figure of 100,000 people employed in it, but they've now lost their jobs effectively. So because this is by Communist Party edict, by state edict. So what we're beginning to see, and then there's a kind of a slogan which has been made much of in the last few months, which is what's called common prosperity. And the idea here is that the party has to apply itself to common prosperity. Now, there are 2 questions which can be asked of this. First, why are they doing this? And I think the answer is that most Chinese now know that the country is unequal and that there is not common prosperity. And that the party, if it is to have its legitimacy as a communist party maintained, is going to have to do something draconian about the inequalities, and that therefore the party asserting its commitment to common prosperity is a very, very important step. But asserting its commitment to it is one thing, doing it is another. And the history of this is interesting because back in 2007, the party asserted that that workers had rights. There were a lot of worker protests going on at the time, and the party initiated a reform which was an anti-neoliberal reform because it basically asserted that workers have rights, and there were extensive rights, and that they had a right to strike and a right to, they had a right of complaint and so on. So the law was passed, but absolutely no mechanism was set up for the enforcement of the law. The result was that people had complaints and they went to the judges, and the judges didn't have time, and then nothing ever worked. And the result of that was that they passed the law, which was basically passed in order to satisfy the needs and requirements of the working people, but it didn't provide a mechanism for its passage. And the result was people had to take to the streets. So there's a lot of street protest. So now the party is in the same sort of position. Is it just going to simply pass a law about common prosperity? Or is it going to make it a case? All the signs are that they're going to experiment down that path. They've set up a common prosperity zone. Now, this is interesting because in exactly the same way that capital got introduced into China by these economic zones in the south of China, so now China is saying, okay, we're going to create a common prosperity zone. And they've taken one province and said, okay, you are going to be a common prosperity zone. And the province is the one where Alibaba, one of the biggest corporations in China, is, and Jack Ma and all the rest of it. That's where they exist. So it's taking a province where there is the greatest level of inequality, and it's going to say, all right, how do we reconfigure this space in such a way that it can reasonably looked upon as a common prosperity zone? So what would that common prosperity look like? Now here, this is obviously going to take resources. And one of the things we've seen is that all of the oligarchs and all of the big companies have rushed to promise that they will devote huge amounts of money and funds to this project of common prosperity and all the rest of it. It's a bit like in this country we have, the Ford Foundation and so on. So the companies are forming foundations to try to work through improvement of living standards, improvement of access to education, healthcare, and housing in many of these. They've been trying to work on this. And of course, at that point, the party steps in and kind of says, well, it's all very well, but you're actually assembling political power by, in effect, controlling these non-governmental organizations, the equivalent. You're controlling them through your philanthropic enterprises. So your philanthropy has to be going through us. In other words, the party wants to control all of this. So that there's a big struggle going on as to how much corporations can keep their philanthropic operations to themselves and how much they're going to have to cede and concede to the Communist Party, that the Communist Party controls it. And I suspect that at this particular moment it's still a bit ambiguous and a bit vague as to which way they're going. Now, if all of this is the case, if this is going on, then this suggests that there's a fundamental reset going on in terms of China's economic development, that it's going to be much more oriented to social requirements as opposed to profitability. And it's interesting to see the responses in the West. Somebody like George Soros says, oh, they're going to come unstuck, totally unstuck, because they don't understand market economics, and they're going against that, and they're going to lose as a result of it. Well, I'm not so sure. I think probably the problem in the West is that everybody does understand market economics, and it's a good job. The Chinese, at least, are prepared to go against market economics for social purposes. And if they're going against market economics for social purposes, then this is at the same time going to lead into other things like, for example, the push right now to start to really take on the climate change issue. So there seems to be almost a revolutionary reconfiguration going on in China. But as Giovanni would say, it's not a done deal. You can't tell. You don't know where this may go. But it is going in a different direction now than it was just 6 months ago. And all the signs are then that this is a different kind of world which is being envisaged by China. And I think on this point, I'd go back to 1978 and say, what was the issue, which was essentially leading Deng Xiaoping into his reforms, into his opening up of a free market economy? And the issue was the poverty of the mass of the population. And there's this saying in Marx, which I always go back to, which is that, the realm of freedom begins when the realm of necessity is left behind. Well, the realm of necessity at that time was grossly lacking, and they had to do something about it. And so what Deng did was to introduce market economy and market competition to try to increase productivity. And the increase in productivity was going to be the basis of China's revolutionary rise to becoming a major competitor with the United States. But in so doing, I want to point out something, which is something which Giovanni Arrighi taught me. China has long had a market economy, but it's had a market economy without accumulation, without capitalism. In other words, the introduction of a market economy was not, from Deng's standpoint, a concession to capital. What happened afterwards was that capital, in a creeping kind of way, came into the system, and by the time that China enrolled in the WTO and all the rest of it, China was basically having to play the rules of the game of capitalism. It has played to those rules to a certain degree, though not in labor market, and now we see not in these spheres like education, healthcare, and housing. And that is, I think, one of the kind of important things to be said. So here is this situation then, where in effect, China is not only doing this because it has to, because China has a long revolutionary tradition and levels of social protest and social uprisings and so on in China, and there have been major strikes in China. So the Communist Party is very well aware that it's sitting on a powder keg. It therefore has to placate that powder keg by actually building an alternative kind of society, one which is much more in tune with social needs and social requirements than what has been happening over the last 10 or 15 years. So this seems like this is Deng Xiaoping saying, oh, we need to take care of the realm of necessity. China now saying, we have enough, in the realm of necessity, but by redistribution and by reconfiguration and some new building in the realm of necessity, particularly in the area of artificial intelligence, that this is going to be our big opportunity to actually create an alternative kind of society. And in that regard, Mao is still this very significant figure in the thinking. And the thinking says very much that China is on the path to be a fully socialist society by 2049. Now, what it means by a socialist society has yet to be configured. And it may well be it is a socialist society that will have a great deal of market exchange, but in which capital accumulation will be strictly limited. And right now, what we're seeing is this party stepping into a situation and saying capital accumulation needs to be controlled. Capital accumulation needs to be, in some respects, sort of rolled back. And in its place, we have to put a form of society and a form of social provision which is based more on egalitarian principles and social justice. So those three mountains that we have to climb are very, very, very significant. And I think that this is, therefore, a moment when we should watch very carefully what is going on in China, not to say it is all good or anything of that kind, but to try to understand that this is perhaps a major transformative point in Chinese history. And if China transforms in this way, this is going to have major implications for the global economy in all kinds of different ways. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.